Welcome to the debate.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're delving into a really profound philosophical division, I think, in creative coding and generative music composition. We're essentially debating the best way to achieve, well, true artistic agency and maximal musical complexity.
Right.
So, the fundamental question is this. Does maximizing, let's say, complexity and beauty in algorithmic music depend on the composer sticking to rigorous, intentional rule setting, absolute control over minimal logical systems? Or does it actually require embracing these non-deterministic, probabilistic, maybe hybrid generative processes that, well, they need a lot of human curation afterwards?
Mm-hmm. A fundamental split.
Exactly. So I'll be arguing for the, let's call it the purity and necessity of that intentional rule setting and deterministic rigor. It's a methodology deeply rooted in philosophies like Plato.
Okay. And I'll be arguing that actually true emergent complexity and real novelty often are only achieved when you leverage statistical generation and these hybrid systems. The composer's role, I think, shifts fundamentally away from total control over input rules, more towards critically filtering the complex output.
Okay, let's lay out the positions then. For me, the goal of high-level algorithmic composition isn't just reflecting what we already know, the verisimile, as the source puts it. The real pursuit is generating genuine novelty, the emergent. And this, I really contend, is only reliably achieved through intentional logical control. Our method demands that we define the minimal set of instructions, what the source calls the Intuizione Logica Minima. This is the single elegant sort of genetic instruction that, if you apply it indefinitely, must generate maximum complexity. So for instance, instead of writing out every note, we might just define one rule. Always modulate the master frequency by the interval of the golden ratio. Every sound that comes out is then the direct logical consequence of that core rule. You see,
I follow.
the entire PLEDA Framework, which is detailed in these 5 phases, starting with the rhythmic core, phase 1, then the generative matrix in phase 2, musical mapping, voice timbre, and finally effects, phases 3, 4, and 5. It's engineered to be a completely transparent chain of deterministic consequence. The composer has to ask, what's the minimal rule that guarantees complexity and beauty? Not, what should the machine guess next?
Right. Well, I respect that pursuit. I really do, that rigorous intellectual clarity. But I do worry that focusing solely on the Intuizione Logica Minima fundamentally misunderstands, perhaps, how true musical complexity actually scales up. The quest for maximal complexity might just be unnecessarily restricted if you adhere so strictly to purely minimal deterministic rules. I mean, generative capability, especially using statistical and data-driven methods, even things derived from data analysis, sort of like advanced AI systems, they offer huge compositional advantages if the human maintains critical selection and oversight. The ideal, I think, is what the source itself calls conscious synthesis, using these human-machine hybrid systems.
Okay.
So in this model, mastery shifts quite significantly. The composer isn't just controlling the rule input, they're expertly filtering, refining the highly complex output. We use algorithms almost as high-powered search amplifiers, or seeds, maybe like how Brian Eno famously worked with ambient music. And crucially, look, standard proven algorithmic techniques like Markov systems already rely heavily on statistical management, transition probabilities between states like pitch or rhythm or harmony. Objects specifically designed for probability, things like Markov or EARN, in coding environments like Max MSP or Pure Data, they mean the composer defines the likelihood of the next musical event, not the absolute certainty of it. This reliance on probability, it's a calculated release of control, really. It moves away from your idea of intentional rule setting towards, managed stochastic emergence.
Okay, that tension you describe between intentional rules and statistical management, that really is the heart of it. Let's look specifically at complexity generation. In the PLEDA approach, phase 2, the generative matrix, its job is to generate raw musical values, intervals, durations, dynamics, using, and the source specifies, Logiche di feedback e sistemi chaotici. That's feedback logics and chaotic systems. We use these chaotic systems specifically because the resulting sequences are, quote, never banal or completely predictable.
Right, chaotic.
But here's a critical distinction I need to make crystal clear. The complexity is emergent, yes, absolutely. But it is derived from controlled logical rules, not from statistical prediction or pure chance. A chaotic function like, say, the Lorenz attractor, or even a simple feedback loop, it's still fundamentally deterministic. It's governed by a fixed, transparent equation describing how the system evolves. Now, its output is highly sensitive to initial conditions, meaning it quickly looks unpredictable locally, but its underlying mechanism is completely logical and fixed. This is fundamentally different from using, say, a statistical Markov chain that relies on probabilities derived from observation or just defined likelihoods. There, the system is inherently non-deterministic at the local level.
That's a compelling and necessary argument differentiating chaos from pure stochastic randomness. I grant you that. However, practically speaking, when we introduce that high sensitivity to initial conditions through chaotic systems, aren't we, for all intents and purposes, kind of ceding local control anyway? And furthermore, musical outcomes can often sound quite brittle, maybe overly repetitive, when they're restricted to purely deterministic chaos.
If the composer's goal is to create something dynamic that feels organic, that moves believably between states, like smoothly transitioning from a dense rhythm to a sparse melody, then using statistical transition probabilities is often far more effective. Markov chains, because they define the preference for how one musical state leads to the next, using those probability objects we mentioned, they let us achieve interesting nonlinear complexity that arguably mirrors natural musical flow better than a fixed chaotic equation might. So I have to ask, if intentional rule setting is the absolute priority, why incorporate any system, chaotic or probabilistic, that forces you to just observe and manage emergent behavior rather than directly defining it?
We observe and manage emergent behavior because the whole purpose of the initial rule is to create a living organism, not some static score. But let's examine where control is structurally maintained, regardless of that local volatility. The absolute strength, I think, of the PLEDA model is the intentional, transparent coupling of meaning across phases 3 and 4. So in phase 3, musical mapping, the raw values from the chaotic matrix get translated into harmonic language. Then, and this is key, in phase 4, voice timbre, the composer dictates that, quote, the complexity of the harmony starts to pilot the timbral parameters. For instance, a high dissonance value generated in the harmony might instantly, proportionally, open up a synthesizer filter, or maybe increase the modulation index of an FM operator.
Okay, direct mapping.
Exactly. This explicit structural mapping ensures the meaning, the context, the fundamental why is maintained through the entire signal chain. The timbral body, the how, is a direct consequence of the musical logic, the why. This level of coherence, I think, is often what generative systems based on large data sets really struggle with. They can produce a verisimile result, something that sounds plausible, sure, but the underlying context or narrative often gets flattened out.
See, I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning. Because controlling complex synthesis, especially in real time or when you're managing high modulation rates, it demands this intricate mastery of control flows. And that feels philosophically and certainly technically distinct from just setting the initial harmonic rule.
How so?
Well, take for example the simple necessity of engineering smooth parameter changes. When you're modulating parameters, amplitude, filter cutoffs, FM indices in the digital world, you absolutely have to prevent sudden jumps between values. Those jumps create audible clicks, zipper noise. So to avoid that, composers must employ specialized techniques, using objects like line shift to create these linear or exponential ramps that soften the transition between parameter states.
A practical necessity.
Right, but that required engineering mastery, using line for smooth amplitude or maybe pack objects to bundle and coordinate control signals efficiently. It feels less about the initial why, that abstract musical rule, and much more about the expert how, making sure the digital implementation doesn't just fail because of computational limits like audio block processing, the sophisticated management of control signal timing relative to the audio stream. It feels like a secondary, necessary layer of control that kind of complicates the claim of simplicity you find in the minimal rule. It suggests the engineering effort itself becomes the separate mastery needed just to sustain the logic.
It is absolutely a challenging and necessary engineering skill. Yes, I concede that. But its purpose is always subservient to the initial logical command. The engineering of control flow, including using line and path, it's done to enforce the logical rules smoothly, musically, ensuring the initial intentionality survives the, let's say, physical constraints of the digital domain. It doesn't undermine the logic, it serves it.
Okay, let's shift then to the composer's agency during real-time performance. This speaks directly to where control really resides, I think. The claim for absolute control often feels, well, impractical during improvisation or live interaction. If you embrace a truly hybrid system, the composer's mastery evolves more towards expert, critical selection, and maybe post-processing.
But is that real control?
Well, in a live context, particularly in live coding environments, modification happens dynamically, right? You can harness powerful generative and post-processing tools, maybe implementing complex reverb using recirculating delay networks, or intricate sound sculpturing via vocoding or timbre stamping. And you maintain your agency simply by deciding which highly complex, emergent output to filter, or emphasize, or even just cut entirely. This external, critical filtering role feels like a necessary evolution of human agency when faced with machine-generated complexity. The human becomes the editor, the curator, not the sole author, perhaps.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it quite differently. The composer's role in a highly structured model like PLEDA is also performing real-time modulation, but it's done structurally. We sort of reject the notion of just being an external filter.
How does that work in practice?
In performance, we become the, as the source says, gardener and performer of a living organism. Our interaction isn't just coloring the output, it's manipulating the very boundaries and constants of the logical system itself. By changing a single powerful constant like the fattore di inerzia, the inertia factor controlling rhythmic pulse, or the forza di gravità tonale, the tonal gravity force governing harmonic motion, we observe how the entire predefined logical system reorganizes itself in response.
Okay.
This modulazione strutturale in tempo reale, this real-time structural modulation, it's a profound act of human interaction with pure logic. It generates genuine surprise, dramatic flair, precisely because the outcome is unexpected, yet it's entirely traceable back to the cause. We achieve dynamic performance without ceding that overall conceptual control to large, opaque predictive models or just relying on post-facto selection. So, for me, the core value I champion remains intellectual clarity, transparency. The rigorous pursuit of building, let's say, perfect rules to achieve music that is, ironically, imperfect, living, and unexpected. This path of intentionality cultivates that essential dialogue between the why and the how. It favors the composer's deep intellectual development, and it guarantees the structural coherence of the whole generative process.
We certainly agree that technical rigor and structural coherence are absolutely essential. No question. However, I think the modern challenge is really using the most powerful tools we have available to amplify the human search for musical meaning, even if those tools happen to leverage non-deterministic complexity. You know, whether the artistic choice is defining the strongest initial minimal rule to seed a system, or expertly selecting and filtering the strongest variation from a highly generative probabilistic engine, both require deep technical, aesthetic, and conceptual understanding. Both, I'd argue, are acts of profound control, just exercised differently.
A different kind of control.
Exactly. Ultimately, the source material itself seems to suggest that both paths are viable. The deeply intentional system engineering approach, like PLEDA, and the critical application of probabilistic statistical methods. They're both valid, clearly immensely powerful ways to generate complexity. The debate perhaps just hinges on where the composer decides to draw the line of acceptable risk and where they choose to locate true artistic agency. Is it in the purity of the initial rule, or is it in the sophistication of the critical filter applied later?
A question perhaps left for the listener to ponder.